She was too sleek for the rest of the world not to be hovering above the muddy reality of everyday existence. She was the very definition of grace and unreachable. Audrey Hepburn was the black Givenchy dress, the string of pearls, and the doe-eyed innocence of Roman holiday. To the outside world, her existence must have looked like a fairy tale made by Hollywood itself. She was married twice, had a galaxy of beloved co-stars, and left a legacy inscribed in cinematic gold. But in the last silent months of her life, when she was facing her own death, Audrey did something that very few people would have expected her to do. She found the one man she'd never completely gotten over in the deepest way. She did it softly and deliberately. Not the one in question, but one of her renowned spouses. It wasn't some famous co-star in an award-winning movie. It was a person, and her absence defined her more than any presence could possibly have done for this individual. When the reader knows who this man was, and why the shadow of his impending appearance was so terrifying, the glitzy story of Audrey Hepburn's life becomes something far more ephemeral, nuanced, and real. Audrey's journey to stability often begins with her past marriage, a marriage that gradually and cruelly squeezed the spirit out of her for 14 years. The man in question was the actor and filmmaker Mel Ferrer. His experience with many languages and cultures seemed to be a perfect reflection of her own. It was Gregory Peck who brought them together in the early 1950s, and the chemistry was immediate. The connection between them offstage became an uncontrollable force when they performed opposite each other in the Broadway play Ondine. In September 1954, they were married in a secret ceremony in Switzerland, and a collaboration was formed which, on the face of it, looked a formidable creative combination. Still learning to navigate the hazardous rapids of Hollywood success, Audrey seemed to appreciate Ferrer's direction of her profession. It was the more established, elder Ferrer who took a guiding hand in her career. But there is a narrow line between giving advice and encouragement and controlling and suffocating. And that line has become invisible over the years. The people around them were beginning to see the toxic dynamics. Ferrer's influence extended much beyond the professional guidance. He had strong opinions on all aspects of her life, what she should accept, how she should present herself in public, which friends she should keep. What began as a partnership between two equals had become a hierarchy in which Audrey, one of the most renowned and revered women in the world, always deferred to the decisions of her husband. She wanted to give up some power which bothered other people. She had a deep urge to be in a traditional and stable family setup. This goal was developed out of a childhood of immense volatility. This was the price you paid for the foundation when you built a house, she decided. It brought a more intimate sorrow to the tension. Audrey Hepburn was a famous and award-winning actress, but her greatest dream was to be a mother. It wasn't a want, wasn't a casual hope, but a deep, agonizing need that had been with her for years. She had her first pregnancy in 1955, but it was a miscarriage, and it was incredibly devastating. A private grief she carried very heavily because of the loss. Tragedy struck again in 1959, when John Huston was filming his western, The Unforgiven. Pregnant for the second time, she fell off a horse during a scene and shattered her back, necessitating weeks of hospitalization. The physical anguish was awful, but the mental misery of a second miscarriage was greater than the bodily discomfort. The grief of these losses built, layered onto an increasingly constrained marriage and began to tell on her visibly. She seemed a bit upset. Her famous slenderness had formerly been part of her gamine appeal, but today it seemed to be a sign of some underlying fragility. The birth of her son Sean in 1960 was the perfect response to the most intense prayer she had ever prayed. For a moment, it seemed that his presence might be the marriage's necessary anchor to keep it sailing properly. In a decision almost unheard of for an actress in the height of her stardom, Audrey decided to give up her job for an entire year to devote herself fully to motherhood. Finally, she got to the bit she enjoyed best. But the big problems that were there with Ferrer were still there. Suddenly, the rumors that had been going around the couple for some times became audible. Stories were told of Ferrer's volcanic rage, his professional jealousy of her towering status, and eventually, allegations of infidelity on both sides. Finally, after 14 years, the marriage was dissolved. But other than being emotionally drained and emotionally wounded, Audrey was leaving the event feeling emancipated for the first time in over a decade. But she doesn't know that the next time she attempts to have a kid, she will suffer in a totally different and possibly more familiar to the general public way. By the end of the 1960s, Audrey Hepburn was not only a movie star, she was a cultural phenomenon. Her films characterized an era of style and romance, including Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, and My Fair Lady. She was a pillar of the community, a legendary figure, her name a metaphor for enduring grace. And then, at the height of her power and influence, she did the unthinkable. She walked away from the situation. Hollywood was stuck. She was prepared to take any job the studios might give her, for whatever pay. The best filmmakers in the world were looking for her. Audrey, however, was certain in her choice, and her rationale was rather evident. The only thing she has never really had is a solid, present upbringing, away from the distorting glare of the public eye. And she wants to do that for her son Sean, by providing him with this opportunity. She thought about that a bit, and then concluded celebrity cost money, money she wasn't ready to pay for her son. While on a vacation across Mediterranean, she had a chance to meet Dr. Andrea Dotti. It was the time of the shift. He was a charming, gorgeous Italian doctor, whose warmth and social ease was a balm after the hard rigors of her years with Ferrer. He was a psychiatric man. The place was swept up in a whirl of romance, beautiful islands, sunny shores, and long, unbroken evenings. He followed her with such ardor and confidence that she was really astonished at his behavior. Audrey then moved to Rome and began the life she had always said she wanted, that of private citizen, wife, and mother. 6 months later, they were married, and Audrey began living the life she always said she wanted. For a time, it looked as if she had found sanctuary. But when she came to Rome, she found out that the Andrea Dotti she fell in love with that summer holiday was not the same guy as the guy herself. Things started almost as soon as they were married, but not in secret. The Italian paparazzi had fodder because of his adulterous deeds, and the image of Dotti published in newspapers with a number of other females. One of the unfortunate qualities was that it was exposed. Audrey had fled Hollywood to avoid the constant intrusion of the press, only to get caught up in a far more humiliating and intimate spectacle on the streets of her new home. But her secret grief was always there, and every time she went into the shop or took her child for a stroll, she knew that her private pain was being exploited for the public's entertainment. She stayed married longer than most of her friends imagined she could. There were two causes for her dedication. One was Luca, her son, born in 1970. The other was her own basic incapacity to bear failure, especially when it came to the heart and family. Luca was born in 1970. As for her duties, she was not the kind of woman to give up easily. But even her strong determination would eventually be worn down by the persistent, open deceit. Audrey's marriage was finished, and though she still said nothing publicly, those who knew her well realized that the divorce had made her defensive and disillusioned in a way she had never been before. Two marriages, two different heartaches, each a different degree of suffering. Behind them both was a pattern of grief, a blueprint for attachment and loss that had been etched before she had ever set foot on a Hollywood soundstage. And behind each lay a pattern of grief. If you want to understand Audrey Hepburn's personal life and her choices regarding her romantic relationships, you have to look beyond her film sets and the glitz and glamour and the headlines of her marriages. The solution to the misery she drank in and the love she craved doesn't start with Mel Ferrer or Andrea Dotti. It starts with a damaged childhood, full of dogma, war, and one terrible act of desertion. She was born in 1929 in Brussels, and her early life was enveloped in a tornado of cosmopolitan riches. Her father, Joseph Rustin, was in a business which took the family to numerous places in Europe, including London, Arnhem, and others. Her 6 languages gave her an extra cosmopolitan polish for her age. But beyond the lovely facade was a nasty political undercurrent ripping her family apart. Her parents were ardent and vocal supporters of the Nazi government in the 1930s. They went to Germany to participate in protests and openly stated their support for the fascist philosophy of the Nazi dictatorship. Audrey was also only 6 years old in 1935, and her father was totally engrossed in his political fervor. He abandoned his family, Audrey and her mother, and went to London to concentrate on his political activities. And he abandoned his family. For a 6-year-old youngster, the reason didn't matter. The outcome was a wound that would never quite heal itself. Later, she would admit that this abandonment was the most crucial emotional experience of her entire life. He spoke not, and that was an addition to the suffering. Sent away to a boarding school in Kent, England, she watched in sadness as other kids were picked up by their parents for the holidays. She waited for a father with visitation rights who never used them. But he never appeared. Audrey was transported to the Netherlands when the world was on the brink of war, thinking it would be a safe refuge. The conviction was all wrong and terrible. When the German army arrived in 1940, the young girl was just 10 years old, living under an oppressive occupation. To disguise her English origins, she dubbed herself Edda van Heemstra, a Dutch-sounding name. Her life was a series of frightening lessons in survival, in living in constant fear, in hiding in cellars when gunfire ripped through the streets. 2 of her uncles were caught by the Nazis and murdered in 1942 for being part of the resistance. This occurrence brought the issue to a very personal level for her. That got her mad. She no longer wanted to stay in the background and participated actively in the Dutch resistance. She stored secret messages and underground newspapers in her childhood, often in her shoes, because she was too young to hide them. She danced in the mouths of the deadliest storm. Before the war destroyed everything, dance had been her first and greatest passion, her dream from the very beginning of her life. Now she was using her paintings to promote the cause. She played at underground resistance fundraisers in rooms that were pitch dark and where the audience could not applaud. This was because any commotion could precipitate the arrest and execution of those that were accessible. By 1944, the situation was considerably more terrible. The German blockades cut off all food and fuel supplies, and the Netherlands suffered what would become known as the Hunger Winter. The population were famished. Audrey and her family ate tulip bulbs and tried to create flour out of grass. Years of hunger had taken their toll on her body. She was left with a range of health problems, including anemia, pulmonary problems, and a plethora of others. And at that very moment, the little girl, to be feted for her ethereal beauty, was a famished adolescent struggling for her life. Then, once the country was liberated from its terrible government, she was given a chocolate bar by a member of the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF. It was a really poignant moment for Audrey, a simple gesture of goodwill that she would never forget. Psychologists and biographers who have studied her life point to the abandonment by her father as the lens through which all her future relationships have to be interpreted. Her attraction to older, powerful, often demanding men like Ferrer was not accidental, but an instinctive desire to regain the comfort and protection that her father had denied her as a youngster. It was not the lack of experience. She was looking for a ghost. She'd gone out of her way to hunt for that ghost in the 1960s, decades after she'd found it. With the Red Cross's help, she was able to find her father, Joseph Rustin. Dublin was his home in 1939. She came to their reunion with a lifetime of hope, hoping for some sort of attention, affection, and emotional healing. She was happy they had met again. She found a man who was emotionally void, emotionally distant, emotionally uninvolved. She did not receive the honest reconciliation of which she had dreamt for decades, meeting his icy attitude. He never proposed to her, but she forgiven him with a whole lot of grace. And on top of everything else, she maintained sending him money for the rest of his life, sending checks to a guy who'd given her so little. This seemingly little story exposes more of the genuine Audrey Hepburn than all her celebrated performances put together ever could. There was another man, another relationship that was, in its own way, as formative as the two marriages that would bring her so much public and private sorrow. She would have a great many troubles with her marriages. His name was William Holden, and the story that followed began in 1954 on the set of the picture Sabrina. There was already a lot of stress in the production. Humphrey Bogart, the film's male star, had been pushing for his wife, Lauren Bacall, to be chosen as Sabrina. The studio chose the lesser-known Audrey, but Bogart's displeasure was evident. He was professional with her, chilly and dismissive. Very clear he thought of her as an unpleasant amateur on his set. But Holden turned another route. She had him completely and totally enthralled from the moment he met her. This was not an act, but a real portrayal of a deep bond that was growing behind the scenes. The relationship on screen was no performance. It captivated audiences. Soon, in a short space of time, Their close working proximity transformed into a passionate and intense love affair. Holden, unhappy in his own marriage, fell madly in love with another woman. When he saw in her the kind of future he wanted, he asked Audrey to marry him. For a moment, she thought she had found the love and stability she had sought. But then came a heartbreaking surprise. The most important part of Audrey's life plan was having children, and she was upset to find out that Holden had had a vasectomy years earlier. She thought it was not a matter of negotiation, but a perfect deadlock. She loved him dearly, yet she couldn't fathom a life without children. She shook her head. Holden was flabbergasted by the verdict. He never really got over losing the case, his pals would claim. The experience was a bitter lesson to Audrey on the necessity for self-defense. She'd had a true experience with Holden, a really deep one, and she'd let herself have it. But she'd pulled herself out of it. Her basic needs had to be addressed first. She'd learned, from the hard school she'd had all her life, that to want something with all your heart and to trust someone with your future were two very different things. After her marriage to Andrea Doty ended, Audrey Hepburn defied the conventional Hollywood standards for the second time. She didn't want to make a big comeback for herself. She wanted to retire. She settled into a restored 18th century farmhouse in the Swiss village of Tolochanas. She named the house La Paisible, meaning the peaceful one, a statement of desire. She declined large film roles and opted for a quiet life at home gardening, walking her dogs, and raising her sons. She was not a world-famous figure, but simply Audrey that the neighbors would run into in the neighborhood market. And now she had discovered a sliver of the calm she had sought for so long. It was in this tranquil and happy time that she was able to meet Robert Wolders. Wolders, the Dutch actor and businessman, was still suffering the loss of his wife, actress Merle Oberon, who had died recently. They met at a charity event, and the conversation was unremarkable. But a few days later, we shared an informal drink that turned hours of conversation. The conversation slowly became into daily phone calls, and the phone calls eventually turned into a deep and lasting love. It wasn't the passionate, glamorous sort of connection she'd experienced in her past relationships. It was more subdued, more profound, and very silent. Both had endured significant losses and the worry of living a public life. Not exhilaration. Steadiness. Not drama, but respect. They gave each other. They agreed that they preferred things that were simple and slow and real. Audrey felt they didn't need a legal document to prove they were connected. Therefore, they never went for a marriage license. And it was right that she should call him her husband. He was her spouse in the fullest sense. They lived together on La Paisible for 10 years and more, in a calm, companionable way. Another development came into her life, unexpected, in 1988. At a UNICEF concert, she was invited to speak from the stage. She knew intimately about starvation, war, and the suffering of children, and spoke extemporaneously on these subjects. So pleased was a senior official of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, by the candid and off-the-cuff comments that he offered her the role of goodwill ambassador. Without hesitation, she snatched it. She did not embark upon this new enterprise until the final years of her life. She visited some of the poorest corners of the globe, including Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, and El Salvador. She had been in refugee camps with starving children and the conditions were eerily similar to what she had experienced in the Netherlands 50 years before. This was not the moment to obtain a snapshot with a celebrity, but the end of a cycle. She believed she was repaying the nameless charity worker who had handed her a chocolate bar, and with it, a ray of hope after the war. And Volders was with her on those rough roads. He was a gentle, supportive presence who wouldn't abandon her to fight the worst of the world alone. She came back from a taxing tour to Somalia in late 1992, and soon after her return, she began to have terrible stomachache. Pseudomyxoma peritonei is a highly rare and aggressive cancer that develops from the appendix. The diagnosis was made by Los Angeles medical officials. The disease was beyond the scope of any procedure. The outlook was that death was inevitable. Audrey received this sad news with the same calm and stability she had faced every other crisis in her life with, the same placid serenity and inner strength. Her greatest sorrow wasn't about her, but rather the humanitarian effort that would have to be sacrificed with her decision. Her sole plea that she might return to Switzerland. She was too weak to survive a normal journey and was flown to La Paisible on a private plane organized by her close friend, fashion designer Hubert de Givenchy. She spent a quiet last Christmas there with her children, Volders, and her best friends around her. Audrey Hepburn passed away calmly in her beloved home on the night of January 20th, 1993. Who was he then? After 2 failed marriages and the heartbreak with Holden, and a lifetime spent navigating the intricacies of love and grief, the one guy Audrey Hepburn in her later years named as the one she had never completely gotten over was Gary Cooper. Not the answer most would expect, but the answer that is the key to her entire story. This was no amorous person. It was her father, Joseph Rustin. It was not an emotional yearning for a parent highly esteemed, or rather the awareness of some basic damage, a rift that was so broad it defined the entire topography of her emotional universe. The little girl, only 6, who longed for a father who never came, is now the lady who looks for him in other men. The young woman, herself a victim of famine during the war, became a humanitarian and devoted her last years to feeding malnourished youngsters. Her father's abandonment was the major cause of her unfulfilled unhappiness in her life. The second symptom of desertion was substantiated when she eventually found him in Dublin, and he showed no interest in her. But she had decided to forgive him. She mailed him some money. She carried the weight of his recollections from beginning to end. The subject of her father came up again and again in interviews she gave later in life, and with astonishing regularity. No malice in her voice, but a tremendous, unhealed pain in her words, and a wordless wonder, a wondering what kind of man he was, and what kind of love he could not give. Sadly, he passed away before he could give her the closure she needed. All biographers who have seen her private correspondence and heard the testimony of her closest friends agree that each major amorous move she took was somehow a response to the original loss she had suffered. She sought out older men in authority to fill the role of father that had been taken from her. Her willingness to stay in unhealthy relationships had more to do with her dread of being left more than once. Her most famous phrase, that the finest thing to grasp onto in life is each other, was more than a platitude. It was the core lesson she had learned through her lifetime of how to survive being let go. Audrey spent the final decade of her piece with Robert Wolders, and he claimed the most striking thing about her was not her beauty or her renown, but her great gift for forgiveness. This was the kind of forgiveness that is not easy. The kind that lets you keep loving someone who has provided no reason to love them anymore. She never stopped loving her father, and she never stopped hating that he was gone. Audrey Hepburn was a woman who spent her whole life trying to offer the world the love and security that the first and most important man in her life did not give her. But the truth of her narrative is in the deep and painful paradox she represented.